You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I'm Sherry Lip, the marketing manager at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here with Stimulus Technologies founder and CEO, Nathan Whitaker. And today we are going to be talking about what businesses may not understand about backups. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and welcome everybody to today.
So I found this topic kind of interesting when I was researching it because I kind of found that the term backup is used, but people maybe don't know what it entails or what it exactly means. So, how do you start explaining that to people?
Well, I guess it depends on how long you've been in the IT industry or using computers, because it has certainly changed over time. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, backing up your data might be a manual process that you were copying things over to a floppy drive and storing it in the desk, or you might have two copies of something. And then these wonderful things called tape backups came around, and you would insert literally what looked like a cassette tape into your server, and hopefully at night the server would back up your data onto this tape, and then you'd stick that in a safe or a drawer or take it off site, and you would have a rotation. Literally you'd have like maybe 20 different tapes, and you would have a daily tape and a weekly tape and a monthly tape, and you take those off site, and you had this complex rotation, and that's how you'd back up your data. And we did that for many, many, many years. And I think there's probably still a company listening today that does use tape backups. But what I found, I this was a funny story back, I don't know, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. We were going into a prospective client, and one of the things we always ask when we do an assessment is, what do they do for backups? What do they do to back up their data? And the person said, well, we use tape backups. We switch them out every day. And so we walk over to the server, and I look at the server, and I said, who's responsible for switching these out? And they looked at each other and they said, I'm not sure. And then come to find out that their office manager, who had been gone for over a year, was the one responsible for switching them out. But the new office manager was not aware that her responsibility was to switch these out. And so the backups had not ran for well over a year. And then we go over to the previous office manager's desk drawer, and there was all these tapes that were unwrapped, and she hadn't been properly doing the rotation of the tapes either, and taking them off site like they said. So they probably hadn't had a good backup, or copy of their data for a couple of years. And now that backups are a little bit more automated than tapes, people think that that automation makes it safe also. But unless you can verify that your data is actually getting backed up and can actually be restored successfully, then there's no reason even to try to do it, because it may or may not be happening. And there's no, there's no guarantee that you're successfully going to restore the data.
So, you can be backing stuff up, but it might not be restorable.
It might not be, or maybe you're not backing up all the data you think you are. I mean, that's actually a common occurrence too, that you set up a backup of your server, but you've moved most of your data to the cloud, and now where is that data backup occurring? And do you have a backup of all your SharePoint data or your Google Drive data or your Dropbox data? So that's also the question is, what data are you backing up? And then to make matters worse is a lot of users store data on their personal computer. And so, you tell users, if you want it backed up, it's got to be in the, in your OneDrive folder or your SharePoint folder. But sure enough, when we take computers back from employees, or, a laptop is lost, they're like, oh, I need all the data on it. And we ask them, why didn't you store the data in OneDrive? And they say, well, it's just so much easier to just have it on my desktop. And then now we have to worry about backing up every desktop computer or laptop. And then, they shut them off at night. So we can't back them up at night. We have to back them up during the day, or, copy the data during the day. So it adds a lot of complications to know, where your data is, how often you're backing it up. And just because it's in the cloud does not mean it's backed up. A lot of people think, my cloud data, SharePoint data, OneDrive data, Dropbox data, that's all backed up. And no, it's just in a different location. It's in the cloud. And if that data is compromised, somebody deletes the data, it will be lost the same as if your server is stolen. Backup is a lot harder, especially if the data is in multiple locations. It's not just in one location, like maybe it used to be just on a server. Now it's all over the world. So maybe in space, they're building data centers in space. So it's not just in the world, it's literally above the clouds.
But I know somebody, their computer died and they had stuff that other people needed to use that they had to get out. And so everybody was not working until that person's computer was fixed. So I say it's not a great idea to keep only stuff on your hard drive.
Well, and it's a problem today too, because let's say a computer gets corrupted, the hardware failure, potentially in years past, like when your hard drive crashed, you could send that drive out to a data recovery company, and they could recover a good portion of the data or all the data through, expensive recovery methods, maybe a couple of $1,000, and you can get your data back. Today, we're not running hard drives in computers anymore. We're running solid state drives. And so they're just memory chips. And if a memory chip gets corrupted, there is no way to get that data back. I mean, it's gone. You have like 0.001% chance of getting the data back because it is really difficult. It used to be, and I don't have it on my desk anymore, but I used to have a hard drive with a platter that it actually crashed. So it's like a record player on hard drives, and it had a little disk, and then it had a spindle that would read magnetically the data on the drive, and a drive crashes when that spindle touches the platter and literally corrupts the magnetic media that's on that platter. And they can recover, that magnetic data, but now with the chips, it's very difficult to do.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking about compliance over the last few episodes. When it comes to backups and restoration, how do businesses demonstrate that that's working? We just talked about how do we know that it's backed up? How do we know that we can restore it?
Well, you have to prove the recoverability, and so a lot of times you'll do some type of testing of the backups. So, you go in and show, for example, our system, what it will do is it'll, if we're doing like a server or a workstation full system backup, it will, run the backup and then periodically start that server up or that workstation up, and then take a screenshot of the data and the server running, and save that in our ticketing system. So that's a chain of evidence of, hey, the data's backed up at this time. This successfully started up. The data is successfully there, and we automate that, and then it creates a ticket to show that. Or if there's an error or any type of issue, it also creates a ticket for a technician to manually look at that. So that proof of recoverability is really important. If you're having to do that manually, that can take an IT technician, potentially a half an hour a day to, log in and verify that data. I also recommend that you periodically ask for certain data to be restored, and see if that data can be restored back to a certain point. The other thing that I want to think about is, there's two terms in backups. There's RTO and RPO. RPO is your recovery point objective, which means how far you can go back to restore. So let's say from a compliance standpoint, you have to be able to restore data for 7 years, and that's your compliance requirement. Let's say I think that's a general HIPAA requirement that you have access to patient records for 7 years. So the question is, are you meeting your compliance recovery point objective? How far back you can go? And it may not be that you can restore every day for 7 years. You could go back to, March 28th, 2019, but maybe you could restore that month, for example. You could restore March of 2019, one backup set. So that's the question you got to ask your IT firm is what can I recover and how far back? And then the harder question, I think, will scare business owners is your recovery time objective. How long does it take to get a system back up and running if you have to restore? And I think there's this perception out there that if I need to back up my entire network, it should just take like an hour. And that is really not the case. And it's interesting when ransomware was really prevalent a few years ago, many companies paid the ransom because the time to recovery was measured in weeks, not hours. And so a hospital that there was a specific example of a hospital that paid a ransom because they had successful backups, but it would take over a week to restore the system. And so paying the ransom got their data back within hours rather than within the weeks that the backups would take to recover. There's this old joke, if you needed to extract data from a data center, is it faster to do it over the internet or load up a 747 with a bunch of hard drives and fly it across the country? And it would actually probably be faster is to restore data from a cloud backup storage to get that drive shipped across the country than to restore it across the internet, especially when you're talking about terabytes worth of data. It could take days to, restore terabytes worth of data across the public internet. So that's the other question is how long is it going to take to get data back and to restore it if you have to deal with shipping or flight or have to transmit it across the public internet. It could take a lot longer than you think it would. So those are the two questions you need to ask your IT company that's doing this work is what is the recovery point objective, how far we can go back in time to restore the data, and your recovery time objective is if I have to do a full system restore, how long is it going to take to get all the systems back up and running? I think you'll be surprised to the answers to both of those because your IT team might not even know the answers or, might give you answers that you're uncomfortable with. So as a company, you have to decide, okay, how much money and I'm going to put into this to meet the obligations, whether it's regulatory or internal requirements to meet both your RTO and RPO.
And do we do the testing for our clients, the testing of the backups and restoration?
We do. That's part of, the IT services is we test, we like I mentioned those automatic startups, and then if they're in some type of compliance mechanism, we can assist those in meeting those objectives. And the testing, potentially might only need to be every 6 months, every 3 months, once a quarter. It doesn't have to be weekly to do the manual testing, but it is something that we can schedule and test those restorations of the environment, especially if it's regulatory requirement.
Is there different testing schedules you do for different industries or different clients, different types of clients? Is it based on need or want, or how do you determine?
Yeah, I think, depending on what their regulatory environment requires, it might be, a monthly, quarterly, annual testing. We certainly want to do it at least annually and do a real outage scenario annually with our clients. But we need to do, automation is my preference to do it daily, to have an automated system checking things. And then, a technician to go in there once a quarter would be kind of my minimum to take a look at what it takes to get data back. So that's what we work with our clients is setting up that automation of those tickets and requests to make sure that we're meeting those obligations.
And one final question on this, has AI changed the way that backup and restoration is handled?
This is not actually an AI question. I don't think so much. AI does a lot, but this is more of an automation. If you want to say automation is AI, maybe that's the case, but honestly, this is more of an automation question. And we've been doing this for a while without AI successfully. Maybe the first time on this podcast, we say AI didn't really change any of this. So is that the
Yeah.
case? I'm trying to think through my mind. Has really AI affected this at all? And AI certainly affects like where the data is stored and the security of the data, but not so much with backups and disaster recovery or restoration. I haven't mentioned that so far. So usually we use the term, disaster recovery and disaster restoration as part of this. So backup, is is part of your disaster recovery plan. Certainly, there's more pieces to it, but we really try to look at not just backups, but really the overall what it takes to recover from different types of events, whether that's a ransomware event, a disgruntled employee deleting files type event. Is it a non-malicious, like somebody changed a file and needs to restore it to an older version? There's different types of events that can happen that requires you to restore data. So we look at what those types are, and then what do we need to do to get the system and the company back up to normal operations. And so those are the kind of questions that we ask: is how do we restore operations, whether it's just a file deletion to all the way to some type of crypto event, that ransomware type event that causes a major system disruption. What do we need to do to recover the business to full operations again?
If someone's calling us, someone wants to call us to talk about backups for their company, what kind of information should they have maybe ready to start the conversation?
I think it's really important to know, what type of backups you are doing currently, what the company that is providing your services is doing at this time. So, those are questions that we brought up during this podcast that you should be asking your team. And then if you want us to look over it, we can go into the different types of software and see what, if it's actually being fulfilled and done properly. So, find out what software they're using, what systems they're using to do your disaster recovery planning and prevention, where your backups are housed, and then where all your data is. So we would need to know, if some of your data stored in the cloud, is it stored on individual devices, laptops, or computers? We just really need to have an overarching idea of where all your data is and what the objectives are on those.
All right. Well, thanks, Nathan. Thanks for all the information. I did put a QR code up there if you would like to get a hold of us. If you're watching the video, and if you're just listening, I will have it in the description. Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and thanks everybody for joining.